بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Inshallah, today we begin a new station, the station of al-Ithar. And Ithar means when someone gives up something for themselves in order to benefit someone else. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points to this in Surah Al-Hashr, in which He says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ وَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and those who do Ithar, they act selflessly, they prefer others over themselves, they benefit others at the expense or the cost of their own self-benefit, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those who do this, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising this behavior even if they have a dire need for it. And then Allah concludes the verse by saying, and whoever protects themselves from miserliness, from stinginess, and whoever protects their actions from the stinginess of the self, then indeed those are the successful people. So we as human beings, part of our fitrah, if you want to say, part of our natural human behavior is that we protect our possessions. Something is yours, you try and protect it. You have some money, you put it in a bank account. Why? So it's protected. And you make sure, no one steals your identity. Why? Because, you want these things and you need these things. So we have this natural inclination. And thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, He points to the stinginess of the self. And says that whoever kind of prevents that stinginess from infiltrating their Islamic behaviors, their iman, then indeed those are the victorious people, or those are the successful people. And the story behind this is, I believe, something we've gone over before, but just to refresh our minds, there was a companion and his family, I believe, or at least his wife, who didn't have any food. And so the husband went to the Prophet ﷺ and asked the Prophet if he had anything to share. So the Prophet ﷺ asked the companions who were around, if someone is willing to host this person, invite him and his wife for dinner. So one of the companions said, I will, Ya Rasulullah. So that was set, the date was set. The one who volunteered to host went back to his home and asked his wife, what do we have for food? And she said, we barely have enough to feed our children, let alone feed other people. So he told her, when they come, dim the lights and pretend like you're eating. Make the noise, when your fork and utensils go on the plate, it makes a kind of noise, so that they think that we're eating. And put the children to bed earlier so that they don't have to deal with the hunger. And then give them all of the food, whatever we have. And so they did that, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals this verse to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet calls the person and said, Allah knows what you did last night, and He says this about what you did. So that's the idea here. Ithar is this selflessness where even the person sacrifices what they need in order to benefit someone else. And therefore, al-Ithar is the opposite of stinginess. It's the direct opposite of miserliness. And as I've identified, Ithar is about leaving something, sacrificing something that is of need to the self in order to benefit someone else. Whereas shahih, is someone who is haris ala ma laysa biyadih. Is someone who is anxious to take and to have that which isn't theirs. So maybe you've come across people like this, where if you have something, let's say you have a basket of fruits, someone who is shahih will look at that basket of fruits and say, I want it. I want it to be for me. And now this is a very simple example. You just do kind of other examples in your mind with money and with other things. So that's the idea of shuh, that the person is so inclined towards the monetary, towards the material. They're so attached to it that they even want that which isn't theirs. They look to what other people possess. Right? And on top of that, if they have anything, they are very stingy with it. And they are stingy with, sharing that with other people. So, al-bukhl, stinginess, is actually the fruit of shuh. I don't know a direct translation for shuh, but let's just say miserliness. So stinginess is when a person is stingy and giving. And miserliness, is the way I'm using it here, is kind of the root of that the person is inclined towards taking what other people have or wanting what other people have and holding on to everything that they possess. And the Prophet ﷺ says, "Iyyakum wash-shuh." Be careful with being miserly. فَإِنَّ الشُّحَّ أَهْلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ. Because miserliness destroyed the people before you, caused them to perish. أَمَرَهُمْ بِالْبُخْلِ فَبَخَلُوا وَأَمَرَهُمْ بِالْقَطِيعَةِ فَقَطَعُوا. It commanded them, meaning their miserliness commanded them to be stingy, and therefore they were stingy. And it commanded them to cut ties with kin, and therefore they did that. Why is that? Because if you have strong social relations, then that demands that you participate in social gatherings, weddings, celebrations. They invite you to Ramadan, for example, for Iftar in Ramadan, you need to return that. You need to invite them. They invited you to a wedding, you need to invite them to a wedding. All of this costs money. Because when you go to a wedding, I don't know how your customs are, but I'm guessing it's very similar to ours. When you go to a wedding, you give them a gift, $100, whatever it is. So that requires some spending. If you invite them, now you have to buy all the foods, and when we have these gatherings of food, we have multiple dishes, right? And all of that costs money. And therefore, someone who is miserly, they will cut ties of kin. Why? Because they don't want that responsibility. I don't want, the closer I am to them, the more social relations I have. It's going to cost me money, and and I don't want to do that. So miserliness is really problematic when you look at it from this angle, that it causes societies, it causes the person to fail. Their iman will fail. Why? Because iman is built on generosity. Either generosity with your wealth, and we call it zakat, and sadaqah. Generosity with your time in salah and seeking knowledge. Generosity with abstaining from actions. So we fast and we don't eat and drink for long periods of time. And therefore, shuh is antithetical to these things. It's the opposite. So someone who is miserly is going to have a very difficult time fulfilling their religious obligations, and thus it leads to them failing. So a bakhil, a stingy person, is the one who answers the call of miserliness, whereas a mu'thir, someone who is selfless, is the one who answers the call of generosity. So the station in reality is manazil, al-jud was-sakha wal-ihsan. It is the station, if you want to give it different terms, it's the station of generosity and the station of excellence and virtuous behaviors. And the station was chosen to be called al-Ithar because Ithar is kind of like the maximum. It's the height of these behaviors, of these virtuous behaviors. So if you want to kind of put it in terms of levels, the first level is أن لا ينقصه البذل ولا يصعب عليه فهو منزلة السخاء. So if you want to look at generosity as kind of levels, sometimes when you give, it doesn't really decrease your bank account. Someone who's a multimillionaire, and they give $20,000. Alhamdulillah, that's a good amount. That goes a long way for an Islamic organization. It goes a long way for a family in need. But for a multimillionaire, $20,000 doesn't really do much to harm their bank account. They'll make it up in a day or two. And it's not hard for them to do it. So they just log on to one of these websites and they give. So it's not hard to give it, and it doesn't hurt their bank account anyway. It's called sakha, generosity, right? For the lack of different terminologies. The second level, which is higher than the previous, is to give أن يعطي الأكثر ويبقي له شيئا, is to give more and to leave for oneself less than that. Now, in our times today, that's not really plausible because of just the way our economic system works, the way our monthly expenses work. We can't give most of what we have because most of what we have goes to bills and these things, right? Rent, etc., a mortgage. But back in the day, it was possible. So someone has, let's say, 100 dinar, gold coins. They give 70 of it, and they leave for themselves 30. This is called jud. This is called generosity. The third and highest level is أن يؤثر غيره بالشيء مع حاجته إليه, is to prefer someone else even though they need that thing. Like what the companion did. They needed that food. They were hungry without it. And their children needed that food. They're hungry without it. But nonetheless, they gave precedence to someone in need, hoping for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's reward. And this is called Ithar. Right. So that's kind of an overview. Now, Ibn Qayyim, before getting into the three levels of this station, talks about various kinds of generosity. You see, when we say the word generosity, the first thing that comes to our mind is money. And to an extent, we see it as kind of only about money. Generosity is when you're generous with your money. However, this is a very poor definition of the word. There are many ways of being generous, and we'll go through 10 of them with Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah. I believe it's 10. Yeah, 10. So it's important that we get out of this confinement, this confining of generosity as being only with money, and understand that generosity is more than with money, with many things. And the highest form of generosity is generosity with the self. Al-judu bin nafs. Why? Because a person is literally sacrificing their self, their life, for a greater cause. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. Allah has purchased the souls or the life and the money of the believers so that they can have paradise. Now, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala links jihad, fighting, military expeditions, with what goes into performing it, Allah always orders it in wealth than the self. Wealth and the self. Whoever gives their wealth and the self in jihad, Allah praises this. Wealth and the self. The only exception is the verse that I just mentioned. It's the self and then wealth. Why is that? Well, because in the other verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pointing to just the broader concept of jihad, of military expeditions in Islam. And that without wealth, without money, there is no military expedition. And therefore, the economy, wealth, plays a major role in sustaining an army. So the money that goes into it is given precedence over the self. Because without the money, no one's going to go in the first place. But in this particular verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the self before wealth because He's talking about it in the context of what is valuable to the individual and what Allah is purchasing. And no doubt to us, our self, our life is more valuable than our wealth. We use our wealth to sustain our life, not the opposite. Unless someone is, a worshiper of money, that's a different story. We will use our money to sustain ourselves. And therefore, when Allah says that He is purchasing these things from us, He gives precedence to the self. So, the one who is generous with their self, in this meaning, that's the highest form. Because what more can you give? What more valuable thing can you give to benefit other people than yourself? And so, any and every country, in every single era of human society, they view the military personnel, the soldiers, with an amount of respect. In our times today, at least in America, it's probably the lowest it's ever been. But the soldier, in previous civilizations, earlier civilizations, the soldier is one of the elites of society. It's an elite class. Why? Because they are viewed as people who are putting themselves at risk so that other people are safe. What more generosity can you show? So that's the first and the highest. The second one, al-judu bil-riyasa, generosity in your position. And riyasa, in the Arabic language today, refers to kind of the highest political position. Al-Ra'is is like the president, or the king, or just the highest authority within a political body. So someone who is generous in their political position, that is such a high form of generosity. Why? Well, because when someone is in such a position, they have access to so much of their desires. So much of their desires. Especially if it's a more autonomous or autocratic, I should say, form of governance. A king can do whatever he wants. No one can tell him anything. He is above the law, literally above the law. And he has access to pretty much, he has access to such large amounts of wealth. He could do whatever he wants, eat whatever he wants, go wherever he wants. There's no questions asked. He's the king. So you have that aspect of the position that's pulling away. And unfortunately, so many of the kings in the Muslim world or presidents in the Muslim world, they use their position for self-desires at the expense of the people. Now, at the flip end, if someone has this generosity, they have a lot of generosity, well, generosity is a form of selflessness. If you are generous, then by default, there is this connection that the person has to broader humanity, that they actually care. If they didn't care, they wouldn't give. That's just the fact of the matter. And the more generous they are, it's just a more sign of a humane heart, a heart that actually cares about the well-being of their fellow human being, their fellow citizens, their fellow people across the globe. So someone who has this generosity and is in a position of public office, then you'll find that person will benefit the entire society. The entire society will benefit from this person's generosity. Take, for example, I don't like to be political, I don't like to point to these things, but nonetheless, it's good to have these examples. Take, for example, Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Before he became the president some 15 years ago or so, literally, this isn't an exaggeration, literally, Istanbul was a dumpster. There was literally garbage in the streets, garbage in areas. The pollution in the atmosphere was immense. The city was a disaster. But because Erdogan, at least we think that he has this generosity within him, he has completely flipped the city around to where Istanbul is one of the most visited cities in the world today. They went from a secular dumpster, poor economy, poor situation, no one even looks at it, to a world power. Where is this coming from? Perhaps from the generosity of this leader. He flipped the country around. So someone who is generous and has this compassion towards society, has this love and generosity towards society, they do this. And so their benefit is absolutely immense. Immense. The third type of generosity, al-jud bi rahatihi wa rafahiyatihi. Generosity in one's rest and luxuries. So we all need rest. We all need sleep. We all need time to unwind. We all need time to just relax. Right? Go home, spend an hour, spend 2 hours just sitting on the couch. After a long days of work, you're tired, you kind of just want to relax, calm your mind down, get some sort of herbal tea going, and just relax. That's very important to our well-being. Right? And that's something very dear to us. We love doing that. Get your little blankie and cover yourself, especially in these kind of cooler days. The hot chocolate, that's something that's valuable to us. And so someone who sacrifices that in order to benefit other people, that is a type of generosity. To be generous with your time. That instead of putting yourself in a comfortable environment, home here in America, you find that some people will go and live abroad in, third world countries, in areas of the world where there is no heat. There are no heaters. There are no air conditioning units. The food is of poor quality. You have to be under the sun. You have to endure that. And they are there in these regions just to help other people. This is a type of generosity that they will sell. I mean, you have people, stories like this. They sold everything, their homes, their luxuries. They were doctors. And they said, what is it with this? I'm just going to go and live or go across Africa, for example, to help my brothers and sisters, either in faith or in humanity, to help them live a better life. This is a high form of generosity. So we can be generous with our downtime, with our free time, and with our luxuries. The fourth type of generosity, al-judu bil-ilmi wa badli. Generosity with your knowledge. I mean, before this, have you ever equated teaching with generosity? No, probably not, right? Being generous with the knowledge that you have. Well, knowledge is power, and knowledge is beneficial to humanity. And the example I like to give in this regard is, you're stuck in traffic, but someone who has knowledge of the city layout and the streets and whatnot will be able to surpass that, bypass all of that traffic in a very simple way. Get off, exit from here, and go up this road a little bit, take this, and you could go on a different highway, or you could bypass all of this traffic. Save yourself 30 minutes. Right? How were they able to do that? Because of their knowledge. Because of their knowledge. And so, if you use that knowledge to benefit other people, if you use your knowledge and teach, you're benefiting other people. And that's generosity. And so if you know something about Islam, you know a sunnah, you have some knowledge to share, then it is part of generosity to share it. Right? And then the fifth level is al-judu bin naf'i bil-jah, is to be generous with your reputation. Some people have a reputation. And with that reputation comes social authority, social influence. And so part of generosity is using that social influence to benefit others. So for example, now you have all the social media and whatnot, and you have these social media stars, these YouTube personalities, YouTube stars, and they're called influencers. Right? Some of these people have millions upon millions of subscribers. I mean, their reach rivals, if not surpasses, many of these major companies and broadcast stations. Like I believe CNN has some 12 million subscribers. I mean, there are regular people working from their apartment homes, little apartment homes, who have 30 million, 50 million viewers, subscribers, whose videos get more views than Fox News and CNN videos. Right? It's huge. These people can use their positions to benefit other people. So there's this one guy called Mr. Beast, a YouTube star, and he has like 50 million plus subscribers. And you find that he dedicates a lot of his time on social media to philanthropy, raising money and using it to benefit other people. A lot. Gets money and distributes it to people. That is huge. I mean, can you imagine how many lives this person can benefit? How many people this person can help? So someone who uses their reputation, their prestige, their social acceptance to benefit others, that is part of generosity. And perhaps some people here have a position within their community, and people go to them or go to you for advice for this and for that. Use that to help other people. That's part of generosity. The sixth type of generosity is al-judu binaf'i al-badani ala ikhtilafi anwa'i, is generosity with your body in the various types or in the various ways that a person can use their body. So, contrary to al-judu bin nafs, generosity with the self, that is referring to like you're literally giving up your life. You're putting your life in harm's way. And contrary to generosity with your free time, what is meant here is that what you can do with your physical body to help other people. So you take, for example, a young teenage guy who is working out and whatnot, has a lot of muscles. They can use their physical strength to help people who aren't as physically strong. They can use their ability to walk to help those who are paralyzed. They can use their ability to hold groceries to help a elderly lady who can't do that for herself. This is what's meant here. So you understand that your body has certain capabilities, certain abilities, and you can use that to help other people. That's a type of generosity. Al-judu bil-arad. Generosity with your assets or your possessions. Oh, I'm sorry, not bil-arad, bil-ird. Generosity with your, how do I translate this? Generosity with your dignity. Let me put it that way. Generosity with your dignity. We all know in our private settings how much backbiting goes on. We talk about other people. So-and-so did this. I criticized so-and-so for doing that. Look what so-and-so did. We're always backbiting. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. Part of generosity, or a type of generosity, is actually being generous with your dignity in a sense that you forgive all those who spoke bad of you. You forgive them. And you are benefiting these people. How? In that they won't be accountable. Allah will overlook their sins, their backbiting on the Day of Judgment. Imagine every time we spoke ill of someone, we did backbiting. And now, on the Day of Judgment, we see that in our books and we're going to be held accountable for that. Imagine. May Allah forgive us. But imagine if someone you spoke ill of, you see that Allah says that they forgave you. Don't worry about it. Imagine how we'd feel on that day. That's very good. That would be amazing. Right? So, generosity with your dignity in a sense that if you don't have money, even if you do have money, but forgiving other people who spoke ill of you is an act of generosity. And we have an example of Abi Damdam, of the companions, who said that, who would say every day he would wake up, Allahumma innahu la mala li. Oh Allah, I have no money for me to give charity with. Right? Allahumma innahu la mala li atasaddaqu bihi ala an-nas wa qad tasaddaqtu alayhim bi'irdi faman shatamani aw qadafani fahuwa fi hil. So he said that, oh Allah, I have no money to give charity with, and therefore I give charity with my dignity. So whoever has spoken ill of me, or who has slandered me, then I forgive them. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Man yastati'u minkum an yakuna ka'abi damdam." Who among you can be like Abu Damdam? Who? So the Prophet ﷺ affirmed this type of generosity, and may Allah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive all those who have ever said something ill of me, just to answer the question of the Prophet ﷺ. And I ask Allah to make me sincere in that regard. The eighth type of generosity, al-judu bil-sabri wal-ihtimal wal-igda'. Generosity with your patience and your perseverance and your forbearance. Put it that way. Meaning, we all deal with people. And the more you live, the more strange people you come across, who do very weird things, very illogical things. And that requires you to be patient. I mean, if you go to the grocery store here at Mission Ranch, just trying to park requires patience. Just trying to stand in line at the cashier requires patience. And so, being patient at the problematic behaviors of other people, overlooking their shortcomings, being forbearing with their behaviors, that is an act of generosity. Someone who is generous is someone who will be able to be patient more and to deal with people more. The ninth is al-judu bil-khuluqi wal-bishri wal-basta. Generosity with your manners and with your facial gestures and just your actions in general. Generosity with our manners, we will get more into this in a future station, a station that's coming up. But the idea here is that the way we interact with people goes a long way. Even if it's something as simple as pretending to be excited when listening to someone, showing that person that you are giving them their attention, smiling in their face, and using your good manners to benefit other people. Smiling to someone brings them an amount of joy, makes their day a little bit better. And if someone comes and is excited to tell you about some news, then it is part of generosity to give them your attention. Right? So, for example, one individual goes to Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala an. He was excited. He said, Abu Hurairah, I have a hadith to share with you. And Abu Hurairah said, yeah, what's that? So he says, the Prophet ﷺ said this. And Abu Hurairah was so excited. He showed him so much excitement. Allahumma salli ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Thank you so much for sharing that. And this young man goes away. And Abu Hurairah turns to the person next to him and says, I'm the one who narrated that hadith. He knows that hadith because it came through me. Right? The idea is that, look at how Abu Hurairah interacted with this individual. Right? How many times? I mean, we fall into this a lot. And this isn't criticism, but it's just kind of reflect on it in our own personal lives. How many times have someone said, hey, you want to hear this story? I have a story to share with you. And they start saying, oh yeah, I've heard that story before. Completely it cuts the conversation. That's not a sin, but there's a higher mannerisms we should aspire towards. That when someone comes and starts telling you something, hey, have you heard about this? Or have you heard about that? Even if you've heard about it, it's part of generosity to sit there and listen with a smiling face. You're excited. And, in our children, that goes a long way. When a child sees that their parents are attentive, they listen to what they say, that builds that relationship, that trust. But even a child, I even noticed with Omar, he's only 3 years old. I mean, if he sees that I'm not paying attention to him, he goes somewhere else. He doesn't like it. SubhanAllah, we just ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us be better. And the Prophet ﷺ in this regard says, لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا ولو أن تلقى أخاك ووجهك منبسط إليه. Do not degrade a good action, even if it's very small. Okay? Do not degrade, do not look down upon any good action, even if it's extremely minute. Even if even if it's you smiling to your fellow brother or sister. It's a small action. It doesn't require much. It's simple. It's for a second, a few seconds. That's it. Don't downplay that. Don't downgrade it. Because at least, you get the reward of applying the sunnah. And let's say that reward is just a few good deeds, 10 good deeds minimum. Just 10 good deeds. That's the lowest amount a person can get for a good deed. Let's just say it's 10. Those 10 hasanat will stay with you for eternity. And every Friday of the afterlife, those 10 hasanat will be multiplied. Why? Because on that day in paradise, everything increases. So if you have that extra 10, the next Jum'ah, each Jum'ah, that's going to increase a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Imagine after 1 billion years, how much those 10 hasanat will have multiplied. So, subhanallah. And then finally, number 10, al-judu bitarkihi ma fi aydi nas alayhim. Being generous with what other people have. Especially if what they have is kind of a loan from you to them. They borrowed it from you. In other words, it is part of generosity not to want what other people have. Why? Because although you might not be immediately benefiting them, you are at least preventing them from any evil that can come from you. And the Prophet ﷺ was asked by one of the companions, Ya Rasulullah, tell me what I can do. He said, do this. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, what if I can't? He said, then do this. What if I can't? Then do that. What if I can't? Then do that. Until the last thing the Prophet ﷺ tells him, okay, you can't do anything, then you need to hold yourself responsible and not harm anyone else. You can do that. Everyone can do that. Because it doesn't require us to give something, but rather to refrain from doing something. So part of generosity is to not get involved in what other people have. You're doing them a favor. Now, if what they have and what they possess actually belongs to you, meaning you gave it to them as a loan or they're borrowing it from you, then part of generosity is not to hold them to that. Sometimes you say, okay, here, borrow this until the end of the month. The end of the month comes. They still need it. Leave it with them. Leave it with them. Give them some more time. That's part of generosity. You give them a loan. You say, okay, in the end of the month, fine. You agree to that. The end of the month comes. You are not in need of that money. It's okay. Give them some more time. Give them some more time. Because it's difficult enough to be in debt. Okay, so those are the various levels of various types of generosity. And it's important to understand that these 10 types of generosity, within each one is a large and wide possibility that someone who is generous with their manners, right, can be at a very basic level, but others can be extremely high. And so each one of these, even if they are practices we have become accustomed to, that's great, but don't forget that there's always room for improvement. And that's just the beauty of our religion. There's always room for improvement. There's always room for increasing the good that we are already doing. قال صاحب المنازل رحمه الله تعالى أبو إسماعيل رحمه الله تعالى says الإيثار تخصيص واختيار والأثرة تحسن طوعا وتصح كرها والأثرة تحسن طوعا وتصح كرها. So the idea here is that Abu Ismail rahimahullah is defining this concept of ithar. And that is takhsisun wa ikhtiyar. In a sense that there is takhsis, meaning this is this possession that I'm about to be generous with, it's not just anything that I have, but rather there's a type of need for that thing. That this is something that's more than just extra that I have, but rather there is a type of intimacy that I actually need this. وَاخْتِيَارٌ, and there is choice. In other words, Ithar occurs when someone, in his or her own choice, without pressure, without kind of fear of repercussions, they give up something that they are in need of. Does that make sense? So someone who gives up something they are in need of, but out of pressure, that is good, but it's not ithar. It's a lower level. And someone who, by choice, gives up something, but it's not really needed by them, that's a generous behavior, but it's not ithar. You need both. Okay. Now, وَهُوَ عَلَى ثَلَاثِ دَرَجَاتٍ, there are 3 levels to this. الدرجة الأولى أن تؤثر الخلق على نفسك فيما لا يخرم عليك دينا ولا يقطع عليك طريقا ولا يفسد عليك وقتا. So the first level of ithar is as follows: is to be selfless with something, to be selfless towards the creation at the expense of yourself, but there are 3 things you need to avoid. So, in other words, when you are selfless, you only reach the station of ithar when you avoid these 3 things. Whereas if it leads to one of these 3 things, the whole point of ithar, or the benefit that we aspire towards through ithar, becomes rendered, useless, or it harms the believer more than helps them. What are these 3 things? لا يخرم عليك دينا. In other words, when you are selfless, it doesn't harm your piety and your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can that happen? Sometimes, back in the day, when the average person back in the day possessed 1 garment of clothing. 1, maybe 2. It was only the rich people who had more. And so, if someone only possesses 1 garment and they need to clean it, what happens? They're literally without clothing for a period of time until it dries out. And even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he noticed that one of the companions wasn't present in Salah. So when he saw the companion, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Where were you?" He said, "Ya Rasulullah, I only have 1 garment. And that garment was dirty, I needed to clean it. And it didn't dry out before Salah began. That's why I wasn't there." I mean, he had no choice. So the Prophet ﷺ made a dua for him. That was just a reality back in the day. Now, what happens if this person were to take his only garment and give it to someone else? Yes, they have a need for it, and they're being selfless in that. And yes, they're giving it to someone who might be in need. And yes, they're doing it by choice. But what happens as a result? They harm their prayer. They can't go to the masjid. They can't even go outside. How are they going to go work? So, although outwardly they are benefiting someone else, and they are applying the conditions of ithar, it's being fulfilled, that behavior is actually harming their piety, not helping them. Ithar is about getting us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if what I give up is actually going to restrict me from engaging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it completely nullifies the purpose. Does that make sense? So we need to be wise. There needs to be a sense of wisdom in what we give. That I'm not going to go and dry my bank account out to help someone in need, and then as a result, my family's hungry. As a result, I can't pay the rent. It is mustahab. It is recommended. It is virtuous to be generous and to give sadaqah and charity and do ithar. But it is an obligation to put a roof over my family's head. It is an obligation to have a meal for them every single day. So if I'm using my money at the expense of this, I am doing a mustahab act at the expense of an obligatory act. That's not piety. That's not religion. So Ithar cannot lead to this. If it leads to that, then it completely destroys the purpose. The purpose of Ithar is to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by doing this selfless act. But if I'm doing this selfless act that is mustahab at the expense of a religious act that is obligatory, then I'm not getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way. That's number one. Number two, وَلَا يَقْطَعُ عَلَيْكَ طَرِيقًا. And it doesn't cut a path for you, a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So the first one is kind of between the obligatory, that by doing ithar, the person harms their ability to fulfill their obligatory acts. The second one is more about the virtuous acts. So, when we look at virtuous acts, some are better than others. Some are more pressing than others. And so part of knowledge is assessing what has precedence now. Do I do this or do I do that? Right? Do I do this or do I do that? And how do we choose? Based on what we perceive to be more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because the goal is to come closer to Allah, to continue our path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes what can happen is that if we apply ithar in an incorrect manner, it will cut our path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if the first one is about obligatory stuff, the second one can be about supererogatory. Again, going back to the example of someone giving up their garment and they have nothing else. By giving up their garment and they don't have another one, now they can't go to the masjid and pray salah. Well, what is more important to our iman? Going to the masjid and fulfilling our salah in the masjid, or doing an act of charity? Now, it's not black and white entirely, but in general, you want to start with your own piety. Help your own piety. And thus go to the masjid. And then if there's extra, give it to who you can. Don't sacrifice your Jum'ah prayer or your the fara'id prayer in the masjid because you want to give something that is necessary to you in order to complete that, in order to go to the masjid. So that will cut their path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's as if the person has given precedence to the human being over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you are giving them precedence over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, for example, there is a maxim in Islamic fiqh that al-itharu fil qurubati haram. Or makruh, I'm sorry, not haram, makruh. Giving precedence to someone else in virtuous acts is discouraged. A classical example of this, a very common one, is when it comes to the rows of salah. We know that for men, the closer you are to the imam, the more reward there is. And for women, if they are in the same room as men, the further behind they are, the more reward there is. Okay? And what happens sometimes, at least with the men, is that you'll find an open spot in the front row. And people are just looking. And they'll say, oh, go ahead. They're giving them precedence. They're doing ithar to their fellow Muslim and allowing them to pray in the front row at their expense. This maxim says that that's discouraged. That's not true ithar. That's not selflessness. Why? Because essentially, the person is saying, okay, you can go ahead and be closer to Allah, I'll stay behind. Each one of us should have this love and this ambition to always have and to do that which brings us closest to Allah and not give other people precedence to that. Now, with a person you're saying go ahead, go, is your father, your grandfather, someone who we should be honoring according to Islam, fine. If it's someone who's going to cause you problems if you don't do that, fine. But if it's just some random person and you're saying, okay, no, go ahead. That's the person is almost is as if they're doing zuhud. They're being ascetic in their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not ithar. And unfortunately, when we were praying Jum'ah inside, inshallah soon we'll be praying Jum'ah inside in the next few months, I would notice this. I'm doing my pre-Jum'ah session, and the front row's empty, and everyone's just on the walls, putting their backs. And I tell them, you guys realize that this is where the reward is. The Prophet ﷺ says that if you know how much reward is in the front row, you would compete with one another. And I just tell them this, and they're just sitting and looking at me. And then I keep pressuring them, and some people will kind of come up like they're embarrassed. It's almost as if they don't want to, but they're embarrassed. And I mean, come on. And this is not healthy iman. So, ithar isn't to be applied when it leads to cutting us off from a closer relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then finally, وَلَا يُفْسِدُ عَلَيْكَ وَقْتًا. And it doesn't render, or it doesn't, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't waste your time. So time is very important in Islam. Why? Because time is the one thing where if it passes, you can never have it back. You can never have it back. Money comes and goes. A job comes and goes. Food comes and goes. A vacation comes and goes. If you didn't have a vacation last year, you could have it this year. No problem. You can replace it. The thing that cannot be replaced is what? Time. So the scholars always advise us not to waste time. And so we need to be very cognizant in how we are spending our time. And not do ithar if it's actually wasting our time. For example, someone calls you and says, hey, you want to hang out? Let's have some fun together. So the person's like, yes, I'm going to come and, I'm going to give this person a good time. I'm doing ithar for them. When in reality, I mean, what? That's just a waste of time. Also, that you kind of look at the ways of benefiting someone else. If you can benefit them very quickly, then that has precedence over going the long way in order to benefit them with the same benefit. So for example, if I could give charity online over a website, or I can go to the masjid itself and, in the box, give it a little bit of money. Well, if I do it online, it's going to take me a minute or two. And then I have some extra time to worship Allah or do something else. Whereas if I go to the masjid, it's going to take more time from me. I'm going to lose that time instead of using it for something else. So we look for the quickest way to bring about the same amount of benefit. And not go the longer way when there is a simpler way. Why? Because we don't want to waste our time. So if our ithar actually wastes our time, then it's not really real ithar. So that is the first level. Let's see, there's a little bit more. ولا يستطاع إلا بثلاثة أشياء بتعظيم الحقوق ومقت الشح والرغبة في مكارم الأخلاق. Let's go ahead and stop here. We're still at the first level. Or should I continue? Let me try and see. Hopefully I don't go too long. So being able to apply ithar in our lives, I mean, it won't be possible, it won't be plausible unless we fulfill three things. We need to have these three qualities, these three characteristics, in order to begin to apply ithar. So the first part of this first level is talking about a wiser and a correct application of ithar, in that our ithar doesn't lead to these problematic things. Now the second part of this first level is Well, in order for me to have this characteristic of selflessness, then I need to fulfill these three characteristics. Number one, ta'zeem al-huquq. I need to glorify rights. The rights of Allah and the rights of people. Meaning, when I think of my fellow human being, when I think of Allah, my heart knows and glorifies the fact that my fellow human being has rights. And Allah has rights. And I am responsible for fulfilling those rights and preserving those rights. And I will be held accountable if I transgress them. See, the Western world is very, very sensitive about human rights. Very sensitive about human rights. The government, whether they apply or not, is a different story. But as the average American, this is something serious. The entire philosophy of the Western world is central or is centered around human rights. That you as a human being, you have dignity. And that dignity is manifested through what we call rights. And me as a human being, I don't have the right to transgress your rights. Okay? So that leads to a type of interaction between society. Why are people in America much less likely to bother you than if you are in your native countries or your ethnic countries? Why is that? I won't say just because people in America have more manners than people in our ethnic countries. I actually don't agree with that. But there is this sense of rights. This person is in front of me in line. That is their right. I don't have the right to cut in front of them. In our ethnic countries, it doesn't work that way. It's more about, it's just you got to fight for it. Right? Why? Because this human rights thing is not central. Now, I don't mean to take this concept and attach it to human rights, but just to kind of give an analogy there. That how are we going to be selfless if I don't acknowledge the rights of someone else? If I could care less about whether my fellow human being is suffering or not, then how am I going to be selfless? If I don't care about the rights of my fellow human being, then I might easily and carelessly transgress them. Then how, let alone be selfless towards them? So the more we are sensitive and we glorify the concept of rights in accordance to Islam, right, then the more likely we will be able to build this characteristic of selflessness. And number two, maqt ash-shuh. We talked about shuh and what that means, miserliness. And here Abu Ismail says what? Maqt, despising it. Using the word maqt, that's a strong Arabic word. To despise miserliness. A Muslim cannot. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala says that he was with a group of righteous people and they discussed issues. And he said the thing that they all agreed upon is that a stingily, miserly person will never be a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will never reach high levels of iman. Cannot. Why? Because as I've mentioned many times, Islam and our relationship to Allah demands sacrifice. We will not pray if we're not willing to sacrifice some of our time. We will not give zakah if we're not willing to sacrifice some of our wealth. We will not fast if we're not willing to sacrifice some of our comfort and our energy. We will not do hajj if we're not willing to sacrifice some of our luxuries and our comfort. It simply will not happen. And therefore, generosity, in the broader definition that we've been talking about, is a key core element to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, if we see that our relationship to Allah demands us to be generous, and that we cannot have a relationship with Allah if we don't have that, and we really want a relationship with Allah, we love Allah, then what is more threatening to our iman than stinginess? And therefore, I must despise it. Because if I despise Iblis, because he is trying to take me away from Allah, then know that stinginess is trying to take me away from Allah. And therefore I despise it. So how is someone who is stingy going to ever be selfless? Simply won't happen. But it's not just not being stingy. We have to despise. We have to hate it for what it is. And the more we hate it, the more then the room will be made in our heart to embody selflessness and generosity. And finally, وَالرَّغْبَةِ فِي مَكَارِمِ الْأَخْلَاقِ. To have aspiration and hope, active hope in gracious manners. Makarim al-akhlaq. Manners, as we will get to in a future station, in an upcoming station, manners is part of Iman. And the Prophet ﷺ had the highest of manners. And there's something about manners. Manners has to do with our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the more we aspire towards better manners, the more we will find room to be selfless. Because what better manners is there than to be selfless? In the broader definition of this term. So if we want to get into the station, even at its most basic level, the first level, then we need to recognize the rights of Allah and the rights of humanity. And not just recognize it, glorify it. Number 2, we need to despise miserliness. And number 3, we need to aspire towards gracious manners. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us reach such a level. And we will stop at the second level within this station. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.